Hi, my friends. Some words of Torah for Parshas Pinchas. The first half of Parshas Pinchas deals with two primary topics. The first topic is where we read in last week's Parsha that the Moabites and Midianites had seduced some of the Jews to sin, and that a plague resulted. Pinchas succeeded in staying the plague by committing a violent act of assassination of two public sinners, Zimri and Cozbi. At the beginning of our Parsha, Hashem declares that Pinchas acted valorously by killing these two sinners, and that he will be blessed as a result. Hashem then commands that the Midianites will be punished by the Jewish army for having brought the Jewish people to sin. The Jewish men are counted in a census in order to prepare for going out to war. The war itself is documented in next week's Parsha, Matos. So that's section number one. Section number two, at the same time that Hashem is preparing the Jews for war against Midian, he is also preparing them for entering and conquering the land of Israel. The census for war thus has a second function, which is to determine the population that will enter the land and divide it among the tribes. We learn in this section about how women are able to inherit a portion of the land as well. The last part of the narrative depicts Moshe as asking God to appoint his successor, the man who will lead the Jews into Eretz Yisrael. Hashem designates Yehoshua, Joshua, as that very man. So that's a real sort of just a synopsis of the first half of our Parsha. And while it would be perfectly natural for Moshe to be concerned about his successor, now that the Jews were so close to the borders of Israel, there may have been something about the events involving Pinchas that intensified Moshe's desire to identify his successor. When looking back at that story, it's curious that even after Hashem commanded Moshe to judge and punish the sinners, Moshe and his cabinet of elders actually did nothing. In fact, the Torah records that they were overcome by emotion, weeping uncontrollably over the prospect of having to execute their brethren who were sinning. But that's quite strange. This is not the first time Hashem called upon Moshe to execute Israelite sinners. At the time of the golden calf, Moshe acted with unhesitating vengeance, proclaiming, "Mi Lashem Elai, whoever is for God, come to me." He then instructed the men to gird themselves with their swords and to go throughout the camp and kill anyone who was worshiping the calf. Why did Moshe act so decisively and stoically, like a warrior Pinchas when it came to the golden calf, but acted so hesitantly and emotionally like a mother hen in this later story? First, we need to appreciate that there were 40 years that divided these two episodes. Moshe may have become a different man, living with, loving, and nurturing the Jews through the desert. His attachment to them, like a father to his children, may have hampered his ability to take vengeance without hesitation. However, I believe there's more here. In the case of the golden calf, the Torah does not suggest that others were to blame for the Jews choosing to commit idolatry. Bnei Israel chose freely and on their own to disobey one of the 10 commandments. And Moshe knew that they needed to be punished harshly if a lesson was to be learned about what it means to be the people of the Torah. But in our story, the Torah states that the Jews succumbed to the guiles and influences of the Moabite women. They did not simply choose on their own to sin, but were rather seduced and pulled away from the Torah by an external group of people. Moshe may have felt great sympathy for his people in this case because he knew that they were not completely to blame for their actions. This in itself was an important lesson for Moshe. His paralysis to act in noting that the Jews were being manipulated from without helped to demonstrate to Moshe that he would not be able to act as a proper leader of the Jewish people when they would enter into Eretz Yisrael. The land was filled with negative influences and sources of seduction and assimilation, very much unlike that empty and barren desert. If Moshe could not act decisively against the sinners now, surely he would feel that same sense of ambivalence and hesitation whenever the Jews would next be seduced to sin by some Canaanites living in the land. Moshe witnessed Pinchas's decisive act of zealotry. He might even have wistfully remembered the man he had been 40 years prior, taking vengeance against the sinners of the golden calf. But after hearing Hashem's praise of Pinchas and how Pinchas would be rewarded for his zealotry, Moshe became concerned. Rav Yaakov Leiner notes that while Moshe knew that he wasn't the right man to lead the people into Eretz Yisrael, he didn't want a Pinchas-like man to lead them either. Imagine, Moshe thought, how many Jews would die in the process of conquering Eretz Yisrael, not because they would fall on the battlefield, but rather because their Pinchas leader would one day find a platoon of soldiers in a house of ill repute and would massacre them all for their insurrection. There's got to be a middle ground between a softy like me and a heartless warrior like Pinchas, Moshe reasoned. He therefore turned to Hashem with the following petition, as it appears in our Parsha chapter 27. Yifkod Hashem Elokei Haruchot L'chol Basar Ish al Ha'edah. May God, the Lord of souls of all flesh, appoint a man over the congregation. Asher Yetzei Lifnehem Va'asher Yavo Lifnehem, who will go out with them, come back with them, take them out, bring them in. And then he says, V'lo tihiyeh adat Hashem katzon asher ein lahem ro'eh. Let not the congregation of God be like a flock of sheep who have no shepherd. Moshe identified Hashem as the Lord of souls of all flesh, alluding to the fact that only Hashem knows how man's spirit can be manipulated and how easily man's weak flesh can succumb. In comparing the Jewish people to sheep, the Medrash notes that sheep need a shepherd to protect them from all manner of external threat, be it wild animals, famine, drought, or theft. Moshe was thus calling upon Hashem to not appoint Pinchas or anyone like him as his successor, but rather a person who would take into account the vulnerability of the Jewish people and their sundry frailties. Hashem responded to Moshe that Yehoshua, Joshua, would be his successor. He was a man imbued with ruach, or as Rashi explains, a man who would be sensitive to each individual's foibles and weaknesses before judging him or her. He thus instructed Moshe to place his hands upon Yehoshua, thereby indicating that Yehoshua would be closer to Moshe in his temperament than to Pinchas. But at the same time, he commanded for this appointment of Yehoshua to be done in the presence of Elazar, the Kohen Gadol, the high priest. This was Pinchas's father, and God wanted to demonstrate that compassion must have limits. In order for the Jewish people to succeed spiritually, they would need a leader who had the sensitivity of a Moshe, but also the commitment to holiness and the resolve of a Pinchas. Jewish leadership demands a balance between compassion and objectivity. On the one hand, certain communal standards of propriety and halakha must be maintained. We can't make accommodations for every single kind of behavior within a Jewish community which seeks to retain its holiness. But at the same time, we need to be sensitive to those who, for whatever reason, find themselves unable to comply with 100% of the demands of the Torah. There must be room for compassion and tolerance even for those who are not completely with the program. During this pandemic, so many people found themselves falling away from some of the finer aspects of Jewish practice. Even members of our own Orthodox community found themselves straying from the narrow line of halachic practice because of the terrible strains and pressures of the last year and a half. As we start to return to some level of normalcy, we're slowly regrouping and coming back as a community. But we should remember to ensure that our communal standards of halacha continue, while at the same time making room for those who aren't ready to recommit to religious life as it was before the pandemic. Our sensitivity to the frailties of the human condition must continue even as we reconstitute the holiness of our community. Each of us has the ability to inspire others by example, but with kindness and without judgmentalism. Wisdom is required of all of us to create this Joshua-like balance in our hearts so that we can inspire and embrace each and every Jew. May Hashem grant us such wisdom so that we can arrive at the redemption speedily. May we see it, friends, bimheira b'yameinu, amen. Here's wishing you a beautiful Shabbos, Shabbat Shalom. Let's embrace each other during these 3 weeks so that we truly do see redemption this month and in the month of Menachem Av. Wishing you all the best.